I wanted to do some recoil spring tuning on this 5-inch M&P that I just had milled for an optic and, added some weight to the slide. It's not unreliable now, but the recoil impulse has changed and I think there's room for improvement. I figured I would make a video about it and go into a bit more detail about recoil spring tuning as it pertains to pistols. I enjoy making this type of content and try to present practical information from an engineering standpoint. First, I will discuss some general rules of thumb when it comes to recoil spring weight, and then dive into some science and engineering explanation of why those rules of thumb hold true. I hope I can present this in an accessible way so that a general audience can understand and apply it. Please let me know in the comments if I've achieved that at the end of the video. After that, I will give a real-world example of recoil spring tuning on this pistol and my testing and reasoning behind choosing the spring that I did. Before jumping into some generalities, please understand that someone who builds and tunes guns for a living will know more about this than me, and an engineer that designs firearms will also know more about this than me. I'm a mechanical design engineer, but I work in the industrial sector. I know how to solve differential equations for spring mass damper systems and energy equations and all that. I have designed and spec'd springs for equipment and tooling. I have also tuned the recoil system on dozens of pistols. But if I misspeak or present false information, feel free to correct me in the comments. I'm always happy to discuss and learn something new. I will try to make it clear in the video if there's something I'm a little bit shaky on, while I'm presenting it. I will also link in the description to some helpful resources with great information from people who know more about this than I do. The following generalities are just that, generalities, because for every rule there's an exception. I will only be considering coiled compression springs, as that is what is used in pistols. For describing spring stiffness, I will use the term stiffness, weight, as in a heavier or lighter spring, rate, and force, all interchangeably. Springs are described by a spring rate generally in pounds per inch. So if I say I have a 10-pound spring, I mean a 10-pound per inch spring, which means for every inch of displacement that I compress the spring, I have to push a force of 10 pounds. Similarly, if I put 10 pounds of force on this spring, it will compress 1 inch. If you put 20 pounds of force on it, it will compress 2 inches, and so on. Weird things happen at the boundary conditions of a spring's travel, and that linear force versus displacement relationship starts to break down, but we won't be considering those boundary conditions for simplicity's sake. I think, first and foremost, the recoil spring should allow the firearm to function reliably and safely. When tuning recoil spring weight, functionality comes first, performance comes second. Factory recoil springs in guns will generally prioritize reliability with a wide range of ammo, so for your specific loading that you're using, the performance won't be optimal. 115 grain 9mm plinking ammo will need a different recoil spring than 124 grain plus P loads to function optimally. If you select a spring for a specific load, the performance and reliability of the gun with any other ammo loading may suffer. And more powerful cartridges will require a heavier spring. A 10mm requires a heavier spring than a 9mm to function safely and reliably. For a given cartridge, direct blowback operating systems need heavier springs than locked breech actions, such as the Browning tilting barrel action that is common to most semi-automatic centerfire pistols. Some of the energy from sending that projectile downrange that way will be taken up by the action unlocking, just like this, where you see the chamber of the barrel drop down. That means that energy is not transferred to the spring in the slide moving rearward, so a lighter spring can be used. Longer slides will be heavier and won't need as stiff of a spring compared to a shorter and lighter slide. Slides can also have cuts in them to reduce weight, and this can necessitate a heavier spring. The mass of the slide and the spring both dissipate the energy of the round being fired. If the slide is lighter, it will take up less of that energy, so the spring needs to make up that difference. Guns with compensators or ported barrels will need lighter springs. I will expand more on this later. A lighter spring will generally increase muzzle flip, as the slide will move rearward faster and hit the abutment at the rear of its travel harder, making the pistol pitch back. This can also increase felt recoil in the hand. A heavier spring will generally increase muzzle dip. When the slide comes forward back into battery, Like this, the pistol may pitch forward more because that heavier spring is slamming the slide and action closed harder. A lighter spring will allow the slide to move faster. This will increase the distance the cartridge case will be ejected from the gun. A heavier spring will slow down the slide reciprocation and cases will not be ejected as far. I've heard as a general good rule of thumb for reliability, the ejection distance should be about 6 to 8 feet away from you. Too heavy of a spring in an extreme case could make the slide not cycle all the way. That is, not travel the full distance to get stopped at the rear of its travel. It may not eject, causing a stovepipe, or it may not even go back far enough to clear the magazine and then pick up the next round and bring it forward into the chamber. Too light of a spring may not have enough force to come forward and strip a round out of the magazine and push it up into the chamber, especially if the magazine is fully loaded and there's a lot of upward spring force on the rounds in the magazine. I have also seen too light of a spring cause lockup issues on tilting barrels, and the spring didn't have enough force to push the slide forward to get that barrel to move up into the locked position. And so as the slide came forward, it would just kind of stop right here, and you'd have to give it a little bit of a push to get it to go all the way into battery. Now, this is one of the generalities I'm a little shaky on, but can try to reason it out, and I've had some experience with it, and that is running suppressors on tilting barrel action pistols. Even with the booster and the Nielsen device that kind of acts to decouple the weight of the suppressor off of the muzzle, there's still a bit of extra resistance to the barrel unlocking at the beginning of the recoil stroke. This means that more energy is taken up by the barrel unlocking, which means there's less energy needed to be dissipated by the spring. So for suppressor use on a pistol with a tilting barrel action, a lighter spring is needed. For direct blowback or gas operation, a heavier spring is needed with the suppressor because it will force the bolt or slide back harder or at increased velocity due to the increase in back pressure. But even with a tilting barrel action, there's still increased back pressure that may increase slide velocity after the initial unlocking. So is a heavier spring better? From my experience when suppressing my tilting barrel action pistols, of which I have quite a few that I run this suppressor on, they generally operate fine with a stock recoil spring. There have been a couple that were happier with a slightly lighter recoil spring. I think on my CZP09 I went from 20 pounds down to 18 pounds and it really shot better. After that, there was also one pistol that liked a heavier recoil spring when suppressed, and that was a 1911. And I think this is because the unlocking of the barrel is a very smooth downward swinging motion due to that pivoting barrel link. And the barrel also doesn't move as far to unlock as, say, a Glock or the M&P I was just showing. So I think it favored a heavier recoil spring because less energy was needed to unlock the barrel, and the effects of the increased back pressure increased slide velocity. On that 1911, I went from like the standard 16 and a half pound spring for 45 ACP and went up to an 18.5 pound spring, and it shot so much nicer with a suppressor. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. I don't really know. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what your experience is. This next one may be getting into the weeds a little bit and kind of outside the realm of practical generalities and knowledge, but it's a part of all springs once installed in the gun, so I want to mention it, and that is preload. All springs have some initial compression on them when they're installed on the guide rod if it's a captured guide rod, or in the gun if it's a non-captured guide rod. More preload will result in a stiffer acting spring. So let me explain that a little bit. Let's say we have two springs that both have a spring rate of 10 pounds per inch. They're going to be installed on the same captured guide rod at the same installed length. One spring is 1 inch longer in its free length than the other spring. For nice round numbers, let's say the short spring is compressed 1 inch on the guide rod, and the longer spring is compressed 2 inches on the guide rod. So the preload force on the first spring, if it's compressed 1 inch, will be 10 pounds when it's on the guide rod. For the second spring, when it is compressed 2 inches to get onto the guide rod, it will have a preload force of 20 pounds. So the shorter spring will be pushing the slide and barrel forward into battery with a force of 10 pounds when it's installed in the gun, and the longer spring of the two will be pushing the slide forward into battery with a force of 20 pounds when it's installed in the gun. So now let's say we're going to fire the gun with these two different springs installed, and the slide travel, for nice round numbers, is 2 inches. So that means we fire the gun, this spring that had a preload of 10 pounds on it moves another 2 inches, and it's a 10 pound per inch spring, so that increases its force up to 30 pounds. 10 pounds for the initial preload plus another 20 pounds due to 2 inches of travel. Now, this longer one that we put 2 inches of preload on for a preload force of 20 pounds gets squished another 2 inches for a total force of 40 pounds. So essentially, the longer one is acting like a stiffer spring because as it's cycling, it starts at the 20 pound preload and goes to 40 pounds. This one starts at 10 pound preload and only goes to 30 pounds. One last thing I'll quickly mention is that recoil springs do need replace. Springs fatigue and take a set from being cycled. They will exert less force for a given displacement and preload as they are cycled and age. So every now and again, recoil springs will need replaced to maintain reliability and desired function of the pistol. This is usually on the order of thousands of rounds. Spring makers will generally give a rough estimate of spring life that should be followed as part of routine firearm maintenance. So let's get into some explanation from a scientific and engineering standpoint. I will try to explain this as best I can so it will make sense and will be accessible to a wider audience. I want to mainly explain what's going on from an energy balance standpoint. I think it illustrates the job of the recoil spring better than using a spring mass damper model. I'll also give a little bit more detail on how the barrel unlocking can affect the work the recoil spring needs to do. I will also touch on what is happening when shooting a gun with a compensator or ported barrel. To start off, let's say kinetic energy, which is the energy a body in motion has, is 1/2 its mass multiplied by the velocity that it's moving squared. So velocity has a lot more impact on kinetic energy than the mass does because it is squared in this equation. So to understand what is moving the slide backwards, what is unlocking the barrel, and what is compressing our recoil spring, we need to understand that it is the mass of the bullet leaving at some velocity straight in that direction. But also it's more than that. It is all of this expanding gases, unburnt powder if there's any left, moving out of the barrel at high velocity as well. And so, yes, that's a very minimal amount of mass, but it's moving at a very high velocity. So this actually does, definitely increase the kinetic energy that is acting the other way on our slide and recoil system. And I will talk more about the energy of the gases coming out of the barrel behind the bullet when I get into the compensator and ported barrel section. So we have a mass and a velocity moving that way. And I'm saying velocity very deliberately, right? Because velocity is a vector, meaning it has a magnitude and a direction. Speed is a scalar quantity. So I can say I'm going 65 miles an hour in my car. That is a speed. A velocity would be I'm going 65 miles an hour due south, right? That's a velocity, speed, magnitude of the speed, and the direction associated with it. So our mass with some velocity is exiting the barrel in this direction along our negative x-axis. So that means all of the mass equal and opposite reaction of the slide, the barrel, and this spring is going to start moving this direction in the positive x-axis direction, right? And so the first thing that's going to happen is the barrel and the slide are going to move backwards together and start compressing this recoil spring. And yes, there is some mass associated with the recoil spring, obviously moving rearward as well, but generally it pales in comparison to the mass of the barrel and the slide. And I don't think it would really, affect the results of any analysis by more than 1 to 5%, which is kind of what we're looking for when we're making assumptions of these systems. So then what happens is the slide's still moving back, but the barrel drops down into these locking lugs right here. And the recoil spring is still being compressed and it's still exerting force back that way, but we still have some mass and velocity of the slide coming this way. So as that barrel's unlocking, First it's moving back, then all of a sudden it starts coming down at an angle like this. And what that does, takes away energy from the movement of the slide and the whole system this way, because you can see based on our coordinate axes, if this is the direction of the velocity of the barrel as it's unlocking, it has a downward Y component, which is completely decoupled and independent from this smaller X component that's still moving back this way. So when I was saying that the unlocking of the barrel takes up some of the energy that the spring needs to account for, this is exactly what I'm talking about, where the barrel is now moving at an angle that is not parallel to the primary direction that the spring is compressing. So therefore it's dissipating some of that energy that was moving backwards down like this into the frame. And so now the spring doesn't need to take into account this little force vector right here in the Y direction. When I talk about either, the barrel and the slide together before the breech unlocks, or just the slide moving backwards with some mass and velocity, based on the mass of the slide and the barrel, and then the force of the spring pushing both these guys, or the slide in the other direction, this is going to have some initial velocity that is, from an energy standpoint, balanced out with the mass and velocity of all that leaving the barrel. So that initial velocity right there is going to be, pushing our slide all the way back until it stops, as I've drawn here. Our recoil spring is completely compressed. And so once this stops, maybe there will be a little bit of a bounce back forward. But for the most part, the slide comes to a stop for a brief fraction of a second, and then the recoil spring brings it back forward into battery. And so that's where I was saying, if you have too light of a recoil spring, it's not going to push your slide forward hard enough to possibly, strip the next round out of the magazine right here as the rear of the slide starts coming forward like that. So let's say the round gets stripped out of the magazine, fed into the chamber, slides coming forward, but if your spring isn't heavy enough, it may not be able to get that last little bit to rock this barrel back up into the locked position. Another thing I mentioned is that if you have a really stiff recoil spring, it's going to bring this slide forward really hard and slam it into battery, and then that's where you get extra muzzle dip. Similarly, if this is really light, it's not going to dissipate enough of that energy of the mass of the slide coming back, and it will allow the slide velocity to be so great that it will smack into the rear of its travel really hard and pitch the gun back and make more muzzle flip this way, and also more felt recoil backwards in your hand. Let's say you have a really cool compensator hanging off the front of your muzzle, or you have ports in your barrel. So obviously the mass of the bullet is leaving with some velocity in the same direction it was before on our negative x-axis direction. But now what's happening is like I said, you have all these gases, which they do have mass. It's not very much, and maybe some particulate, but it's leaving at a very high velocity, right? So what's happening now is, if you have a compensator or ports, let's go ahead and start with ports, right? All of a sudden, as the bullet passes here, blows a bunch of gas up here. Bullet passes here, blows a bunch of gas up here. Bullet passes here, blows more gas out of here. So now all of this gas right here that normally would have been coming straight out of the barrel and increasing the energy with which the slide is going to be moving rearward is vented directly up in the positive Y direction, so it no longer has an influence on anything happening along this axis. So once again, that takes away more of the energy that your recoil spring needs to deal with. That's why you can run a lighter recoil spring on a barrel that's ported. Similarly with the compensator, as soon as the bullet passes this point right here, all that gas starts coming out and expanding and going like this, and then it hits here and goes straight upwards and goes like this, right? And both ports and compensators are great because they push the muzzle down, right? They're moving the mass of the muzzle down with some velocity because they have energy that is the mass going up at a certain velocity of the gases being redirected. And so similarly with the porting, now you have all this gas that would have came out here and, you know, been added into the energy that starts moving the slide rearward. But now, again, it's going straight up in the positive Y direction. It has no influence on what is pushing the slide rearward. So again, if you have a compensator, generally you can run a lighter recoil spring. So all of that talk about compensators and ports and how they redirect gas brings me to the point that bullet weight has nothing to do with how a compensator or barrel ports will operate. What will make a compensator and a ported barrel work better and mitigate more muzzle flip is more gas leaving them at a higher velocity. So it really has nothing to do with the weight of the projectile, but it has more to do with, you know, the powder charge and I guess case capacity and stuff like that. Generally heavier for caliber bullets. Like if you stick 147 grain in a 9mm case, it actually takes up more room inside there because it's a physically longer bullet. So you can't fit as much powder in there. The powder charge is less. I don't reload. There's a lot of people who reload and understand a lot more about this than I do. And especially, you know, competition shooters are going to be real tuned in to what kind of loading of their cartridges makes their compensators and ports work better. Woo! Got that out of the way. Man, I love my whiteboard time. I hope what I just presented and went into nauseating detail on makes sense and is helpful. So now let's get into the actual practical recoil spring tuning of this pistol. Essentially, when I added this Delta Point Pro, which is kind of on the heavier side of red dots, and I added these really tall steel iron sights, I added a decent amount of mass to this 5-inch slide, which is already quite a long and heavy slide for the 9mm, you know, 115 grain lighter range ammo I generally run through it. With the factory spring, which I believe is 16 pounds, it cycles just fine. It's reliable, but the ejection, the cases are probably only going like 2 feet away, 3 feet away. So there's an indication that the recoil spring is too stiff and it's making the slide velocity too low. If the slide velocity increased, it would spit my empties further away. And also adding mass to the slide, since that's dissipating more of the energy from the bullet being fired out the front, you can run a lighter spring. Since this gun was functioning reliably with the factory spring, this tuning is really based on performance, and a large part of that will be qualitative based on how it feels to me as the shooter. All of the ammo used in the footage you're about to see was my normal Blazer Brass 115 grain 9mm range ammo. To try to quantify the performance, at least relatively between the springs, I am characterizing muzzle flip during recoil at its highest point and muzzle dip at its lowest point as the slide comes back into battery. I am also going to be comparing ejection pattern distance between the springs. At the end of all this, I will overlay all the muzzle angle measurements to help me determine the best spring weight. That won't be the full story though, because how the gun felt to shoot in my hands will also be important. Keep in mind there will be trade-offs as well. A lighter spring will make the muzzle dip less as the slide comes back into battery, but a lighter spring will also increase muzzle flip as the slide velocity increases as it smacks to the rear harder. That's kind of where the preference of what recoil feels best for you and allows you to get back on target faster comes into play. Another way to gauge which spring is right from a performance perspective is to run a drill you're very familiar with on a shot timer and look at your split times and overall performance. Looking at the relative muzzle flip angles, they are pretty close. I tried to maintain even grip pressure between the tests. You can see that the green line, which is the 15-pound spring, is at a lower angle than the factory heavier spring. I would expect the opposite, but I think those springs are close enough in weight that it's hard to compare them in this manner. It's clear to see that the 13-pound spring, the blue line, had the most muzzle flip, which is what I would expect, but it's not by a huge margin. Looking at the muzzle dip relative angles, there's not much difference between the 13 and 15-pound springs, but the heaviest factory spring clearly shows a more extreme muzzle dip angle. So looking at the ejection with the different springs, you can see that the factory spring, the empties are kind of just dribbling out down by my feet. With the 15-pound spring, the empties are going a little bit further out, but they're still pretty close in. With the 13-pound spring, the empties are going a little bit further, kind of getting into that, 5, 6, 7, 8 feet away that I want to see. I'm going to go with the 15-pound spring after this testing. The muzzle angle comparison shows it had minimal increase in muzzle flip, but a bit less muzzle dip when the slide came back forward. Qualitatively, it felt softer shooting and a little less snappy in my hand than the 13-pound spring. The ejection was still a bit close, but it runs reliably. So to kind of summarize this and wrap it up, initial recoil spring selection should be viewed from a functionality and reliability standpoint. After that, springs can be tuned for performance and specific loadings of a cartridge. Recoil spring tuning for a defensive application will likely be different than tuning for a competition application. But for a defensive application, I would recommend leaving the factory recoil spring in the gun. It was designed to operate reliably with the widest range of conditions and with the widest range of ammunition. Regarding the performance aspect, there are generally agreed upon good and bad performance characteristics of a pistol, but some of it will also be subjective and specific to your hand size, body mechanics, and what your preferences are. So I hope this video has given you some good information and maybe a starting place if you're considering tuning recoil springs on your pistol. It's difficult sometimes to figure out if you even need to start with a heavier or lighter spring. I would say make that first judgment based on ejection distance. If the cases are barely dribbling out of the gun 1 or 2 feet away, you need to increase slide velocity by reducing recoil spring weight. If the empties are being sent 10 plus feet away, then you should start looking at heavier springs maybe. Let me know your thoughts on the information I just presented. Do I know what I'm talking about? Am I full of shit? Share your experiences with pistol recoil spring tuning in the comments so that I and others can see it as well. And as always, thanks so much for watching.